Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is Brandon Mitchener. He is the Executive Director at Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad. Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. It represents directly or indirectly some 9 million Americans living abroad who have had enough of the discrimination and hassles associated with U.S. citizenship-based taxation in favor of a system of residence-based taxation used by the other 193 odd countries in the world. So we welcome Brandon Mitchener to the podcast. How you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm doing well.
And you're based in Brussels.
Yeah, I've lived in Brussels, Belgium for the past 26 years, in Europe for the past 36 years.
And were you born in the U.S. or were you an accidental American?
Yeah, I may not sound like it because I've lived overseas so long, but I was born in Lansing, Michigan, and grew up in the Chicago area, mostly in the state of Indiana. First Valparaiso, Indiana, and then studied in southern Indiana, studied in New York. The last place I lived in the U.S. was New York, and that's where I still vote because that's how the U.S. system works,
Okay, so you got a little bit of that Midwest twang. I have a bit of a Canadian twang because I was born in Canada, but I'm a dual citizen because my mom is American. So that's kind of how I accidentally became American.
You poor thing. Yeah.
And I guess before we crack into it, I was just curious: have you learned French yet? Have you learned Dutch?
I have, well, not Dutch, but I'm the unusual American who speaks a few languages decently. So I studied German in college. That was my first language. Then I started learning Italian, which I speak fluently in the meantime. Also helps that I was married to an Italian for 18 years. And since I moved to Belgium, I had to learn French. So I'm now very good at that. And I've learned and forgotten Russian, and I'm working on Greek now. So I like languages. I started out once thinking I would study linguistics, and then for whatever reasons went for journalism, and that's what took me to Europe.
Cool. Well, bienvenue au podcast.
Merci.
I'm gonna kind of play dumb on this episode here today for the benefit of the audience. So I thought a fun question off the bat would be obviously the organization is Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad. Is the current system unfair?
Absolutely. I mean, to those who know what I'm talking about, this is preaching to the choir. But and to those who are just traveling in in Latin America, it's not something you need to worry about yet. But should you ever decide to live in Latin America long enough to become a tax resident there, you should be aware of what you're getting into. I've known so many Americans who've moved overseas without any idea of what they were getting themselves into. And I'll back up a little bit for the newbies. I mean, if you move overseas as, let's say, a professional expat, you've got a big multinational company that's got you on an expat policy, you don't need to worry about much because it's as if you continue to live in the U.S. and pay taxes in the U.S. If you move overseas, either to study, to work on your own, or even to retire, then you become a tax resident of another country. But the trick is that the United States never really lets go of you. Almost every country in the world, I think the only other exception is Eritrea, taxes its citizens on the basis of where they live. So if you live in the country, you pay taxes there. If you don't live in the country, you don't pay taxes there. The U.S. and Eritrea choose to tax people no matter where they live, no matter how long they live there. So that's what I meant by you never actually escape or they never let go. So I've lived in Europe for more than 30 years, but I still have to file a U.S. tax return every year. I never owe any U.S. taxes because I pay so many taxes in Europe. But I have to pay accountants to convince the IRS that I don't owe any U.S. taxes, and just the accounting fees cost me a couple $1,000s a year. So that's what every American overseas goes through, as long as they actually do try to comply with the law and file a U.S. tax return. Many don't. That's another story.
And why don't they file, or who should be filing as an American living abroad?
Well, the simple answer is everyone theoretically should be filing. You identified yourself as an accidental American, so you're, I'd say, less accidental than others. And I think in the sense that your mother was American, and you presumably grew up feeling somewhat tied to the U.S. because of your mother. There are many Americans, let's say, who were born in the U.S. To foreign parents. I work closely with a man who's French, but he's also American because his French parents were in California when he was born. He left when he was in diapers. He still struggles to speak English. Um, and nevertheless, the US government considers him an American because he was born in the United States. So this is a guy with no social security number, no US passport, who doesn't want anything to do with the US system, but the US still considers him a citizen and makes his life difficult. So you asked the unfairness question before. One, the initial fairness is just that they continue to chase us even though we no longer live in the country. But then U.S. Tax laws and enforcement of tax laws makes it difficult for foreign financial institutions like a bank or a pension plan or insurance company to want to do any business with Americans overseas. So I know
Mm.
people who've had their bank accounts closed. You know, their local bank in whatever country they live, their bank account has been closed, and sometimes with no reasons. And the only reasonable explanation for a bank account suddenly being closed is that the bank has discovered you are American and wants nothing to do with you. And there are other people who can't open a bank account in the first place. Or, with my bank, I'm allowed to have sort of basic accounts, but I can't invest anything in Belgium where I live. So I have to, my investments, other than real estate, have to be in the United States, which is crazy. I have not lived in the US for 30 years, and I have to put my money into US investments in a currency that I don't use and may never use again. So this introduces exchange rate risk. So there's all kinds of ways that this U.S. Law is unfair to Americans overseas, and we're trying to do something about that.
So you're saying there's no way as an American we can just say, "Hey, don't tax me anymore"?
Well, you can run, but you can't hide. So there are some people who just say, "I'm just not going to enter the U.S. system as long as the IRS isn't on to me. If I've never filed a tax form, for example, I'll just take my chances and hope that they never catch up with me." The problem with that is that the US has got all kinds of international treaties with other countries now, and the banks share information. So if you tell your bank that, let's say, you're French or Mexican, or let's take South American examples, Argentinian or Brazilian, if you're a dual citizen, you can get away with that. But if you're only an American citizen and you decide to move to Mexico or to Brazil, Argentina, whatever, then your bank is going to have record of you being an American citizen. And at some point, the IRS will ask that bank if they have any dealings in the US. What American citizens do you have accounts for? How much money do they have in those accounts? And what are their details? And this really happens. I can tell you from personal experience, which luckily did not cause me any problems yet, but I learned that one of my employers over the years had opened an account for me in a tax haven in the Channel Islands, in between the UK and France,
Nice.
without telling me. They had created like a temporary holding account in my name with my U.S. Social Security number, and I wasn't even aware that this account existed.
Oh
But
wow.
I found out about it because the Belgian National Bank basically asked me, "What is this account? You haven't declared it." And then I declared it both to the Belgian National Bank and to the U.S. And problem solved. But this kind of stuff can happen just because the banks talk to one another, even if you're trying to lie low.
Hmm. Do you have any anecdotes you could share about unfair situations? I'm sure you probably hear more unfair situations than most people.
Well, I can tell you one right off the bat. So I've got two boys. One is 29, one is 26. The 29-year-old lives in London, and he's an entrepreneurial type. He studied artificial intelligence and natural sciences. He founded a company in the UK, then shut that down because it didn't work well. A couple of years later, he founded another company. And in the process of going through paperwork for this company, his bank said, "Oh, you're American," and then they wanted to make sure that he had done everything by the book because they didn't want any problems with the U.S. government. And it turned out that when he started providing them information, they said, "Oh, but he had actually reported he'd filed tax returns, he's reported his income, but he did some things incorrectly. And just making it right cost him £20,000. I think that's about $25,000. So the kid is, okay, he's 29, but he's my kid, but he doesn't have that much money. He's got a wedding next year. That could have completely paid for his wedding. Instead, he paid accountants $25,000 to make right a situation in which he never should have been in, never should have found himself in the first place. He's never
Mm.
earned any money in the U.S. Why?
But he
Why
was
should?
born in the U.S.
No, he was born in Germany.
Oh, so how did they know?
Because I'm American, and I registered him with the consulate when he was born, and I got him a passport because I wanted him to feel American. I
Uh-huh.
didn't have plans to stay in Germany forever, so I wanted to make sure that he's not entitled to German nationality under German law just because he's born there. They do
Right.
that because it's the complete contrast to the U.S. The U.S., if you're born in the U.S., you're automatically American. In Germany, it's not the case. So my son was American and Italian and French because the mother was French Italian. So I basically got him into this situation because I declared his birth overseas, and most Americans like me who've grown up in the U.S. would probably do this. And there's a form you fill out called the Consular Report of Birth Abroad. So the State Department keeps track of how many people are declared like that, and I
Uh-huh.
don't know the number off the top of my head to be honest, but it's a sizable number. But then there are all these accidental Americans who are not at all in the U.S. system, and sometimes they run into the same problems, where suddenly I know another man, a French man, who was quite wealthy when he wanted to sell his business. It's a private aviation company, uh, and then he realized that he was going to be socked with a gigantic tax from the U.S. because he wanted to sell his company. And he had never felt American, like the other guy that I mentioned. He was born in Texas to French parents, and then moved back, and never really had any U.S. connections. But at that moment that he wanted to sell something for, let's say, a couple $1 million, the IRS was going to be all over him unless he renounced his citizenship, which is what he eventually did, rather than give the U.S. Something that he thought they didn't deserve. He went through a lot of paperwork to renounce his U.S. citizenship.
Is it a lot of paperwork to renounce?
Well, it's not that much paperwork, actually. I've never done it, so I can't give you any firsthand information. But as I understand it, in order to renounce, if you're, let's say, a U.S. citizen in good standing like me, who's always filed the tax returns, then you just you fill out a form, you pay a fee, kind of an exit tax, and then you can give up your U.S. passport. It's only
It's not
worth
an exit tax, right? It's just like a 2K fee or something, and they were talking about reducing it
kind of
back,
an
or
exit tax, though, isn't it? It's not like the
I
Canadian exit,
guess.
but it's
Yes.
kind of an exit tax.
Okay. It's
But
fixed fee though.
yeah, it's a fixed fee.
Okay.
And this fixed fee will soon become lower. Right now, it's about $2,500, but it's going to lower to $450 or so in September because of a lawsuit brought against the State Department by the Association of Accidental Americans. Because when the fee was raised from 450 to 2,500, they said, "Why? There's absolutely nothing to justify this increase. The work is the same, and this is unfair and disproportionate." And they won miraculously, and now the State Department has to lower the fee. But the most important thing about this renunciations is, of course, this only works if you get a second passport. If you're only American,
Uh-huh.
you can't renounce your citizen. You got to keep some passport somewhere.
We tell people this. Okay. And I guess it doesn't work like this for people from other countries. This is a uniquely American phenomenon.
Well, like I said, Eritrea does this as well, and there are some other countries which have some very narrow rules on taxation of people who are posted abroad for a short while or something like that, and then move back or don't spend enough days overseas to justify being taxed as an expat. But yes, I mean, the United States is, let's say, the only major developed country that does this to its citizens. I often give people in Congress the example of my kids. So my son, my second son, born in Belgium, is 26 years old. Again, the mother French Italian, so he's got those two passports. Because I'm American, he's got an American passport, and he also became Belgian because Belgium allowed him to do that because he was born here. So the kid's got four passports, but he has never been asked by the French to fill out any forms for them or pay them any money. The Italians don't bother him. It's only the Americans who bother him. And he, until very recently, had never lived in the United States in his life. Now he actually just moved to the U.S., so that's a situation has changed. But for the first 26 years, he lived in the U.S., had nothing to do with the U.S., and the U.S. Reserves the right to come after people like him.
Sure. And you mentioned you spoke to Congress. Did you like actually go and like speaking on record, or was this just like talking to congressmen offline, or?
In between. So the good news about COVID is that everybody has gotten used to video meetings, and it's perfectly easy to have a video meeting with a congressional staffer. I won't say with a congressman or a senator, but it's perfectly easy to have video meetings with congressional staffers. And because the goal of tax fairness for Americans abroad is really only one goal, it's to change U.S. law. People you need to talk to are in Congress. So we are working with the biggest lobbying firm in Washington, and we are setting up meetings with people in the two committees that matter. It's the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And we are basically just going down the list, trying to meet with the tax advisor in each and every office in order to tell them what's happening to Americans abroad. Sometimes they're aware of it, but not always, and to warm them up for the fact that we'll soon be coming back to them with a proposal for a bipartisan bill to change the law forever to free Americans from this extraterritorial taxation.
Okay. And so when you go to Congress and the Ways and Means and you say, hey, stop taxing us, and they're probably thinking, well, we're really broke and we need the tax revenue. How do you kind of make it a win-win for everybody?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, here's the thing: the vast majority of Americans who live abroad don't owe any U.S. taxes. Let's say, I don't know about Latin America so much, but if you take the example in Europe, the countries are very high tax countries. So I pay way more taxes in Belgium than I would ever owe in the United States. And because of the international tax treaties, I qualify for something called a foreign earned income exclusion, which means the first $95,000 you earn, you wouldn't be taxed on in the US. And then there's tax credits. So I get a credit in the US for all the money that I pay in taxes in Europe. So the combination of these things means that I never owe any US taxes. Of course, there
Hmm.
are some lower tax countries where that's not the case. You may end up paying. And in the worst case scenario, and this does exist, there are places where you might end up being taxed double. I mean, paying like the full tax rate, both
Because
to the
there's no
US.
because there's no treaty.
Yeah, because there's no treaty or not a good treaty. So that's one thing. We start by saying the vast majority of Americans overseas don't owe any U.S. taxes anyway, and even according to the State Department's number, no, sorry, it's the IRS numbers. 87% of the people who do file tax returns don't owe any money. So,
Wow.
so
Wow. I
that's
didn't know that.
yeah.
Okay.
So again, there are many Americans who don't file the tax returns. That's another issue. But those who do, 87% don't owe IRS anything. So
Okay. But even presumably that 13% of 9 million some odd Americans abroad represents billions and billions of dollars, right?
but nobody knows. I mean, one of the things we tell every congressional staffer, and we're going to start telling other people as well in the IRS and think tanks, is the numbers are fuzzy. The estimates on the number of Americans abroad range from around 5 million to 9 million. The 9 million was a State Department number, but they're not using that very much anymore. So that's already a big question: is how many Americans are there? Then, how many of those are accidental Americans? How many of them are children or retired people who would have essentially not much income to tax? So it's only really the working age population of Americans overseas that the IRS would ever care about. And the majority of those who file taxes don't owe anything.
Okay. And what kind of response have you gotten so far?
Well, your initial question or the previous question was prescient because one of the questions we get very often from Congress is, yeah, but how do we prevent the American billionaire from leaving the country in order to be able to avoid paying American taxes? They're all worried about the billionaires. I say they're trying to catch the whales and instead they're catching the minnows. Because the billionaires will always find a way around it. They will create a trust, they'll pay themselves in a way that doesn't actually have any taxes. Like there are plenty of examples of billionaires who pay no taxes, right? And there's no reason to believe that would be any different if they moved overseas than if they lived in the United States. So that's one of the questions that we get from Congress. And to that we say we're happy to work with Congress to build guardrails to prevent people from moving overseas strictly for the purpose of evading taxes. What we want to do is have a law that will protect all the people who are perfectly normal, average, hardworking Americans who are not overseas for the purpose of evading taxes, but because they work there, they study there, they fell in love there, or they're retired there. There's all kinds of reasons people live overseas, and that the majority of these are not going to owe that much in taxes. Because another thing we don't know is how much it costs the IRS to chase all these Americans overseas. They have to pay, a
Exactly.
small army of people to chase after us for questionable return on investment, but we don't know. So we're asking congressional staffers to actually force the IRS to cough up some numbers and help us better document the scale of the problem so that we can find the most appropriate way to fix it. And then I think the last answer to that question, what do we tell them to sort of put them at ease, is we're happy to work with them and find a way to make this revenue neutral. So it does not need to cost the U.S. government a cent. There's different ways of doing that, either income thresholds, so that the vast majority of people would be free of Uncle Sam, but then maybe those who are super wealthy would have to continue to contribute. Another way is, like I said, delaying the entry into force of the residence-based taxation, so you can't move overseas and a month later claim a foreign residence for tax purposes. You need to do it after having lived somewhere for a couple of years or something. There's other things like that they could do. Another one is the Canadian system of an exit tax. Say, okay, you want to move overseas? Well, you got to pay an exit tax.
Hmm.
So I'm not an expert on the Canadian system, but I've read up a little bit, and it essentially consists of you telling the government, "I'm never coming back. Therefore, you tax me on the liquidation of my assets as if I'm never coming back."
Yep.
So I know there's exceptions that, like, you don't pay tax on the sale of your home. If you sell a house in Canada to move to Mexico, for example, then you don't have to do that.
Your primary home.
Yeah, primary
But
home.
you would actually, if you were a dual citizen, you would owe taxes in the US on that, which
Yeah,
is crazy.
this
Yeah.
is crazy. We
Yeah.
get it coming and going.
This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Crema Social. Crema Social is like TikTok for international dating. It's an app you can download right now on your phone, and 3 out of 4 people on Crema are single women. The app was founded in Colombia, so unsurprisingly, there are a lot of Latinas on the app, by the way. So, how does it work? Crema Social is a social meal experience where you invite a hot girl for a lunch date via video call and food delivery. New concept, so you'll have to try it out for yourself, but this is probably the best way to meet Latinas before you visit the country. So if you're in Latin America or planning to visit Latin America, download Crema Social now and start getting dates right away. There will be a link in the description to download, or just search Crema Social on your favorite app store. Have fun, guys. This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by BitRefill. BitRefill is the best way to spend your crypto in Latin America. Purchase gift cards or mobile refills from more than 3,500 brands in 186 countries instantly, safely, and privately. You can also apply the code MyLatinLife at checkout to get 10% back on your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information. This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Job Stacking. If you are a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then Rolf Holtze, the author of Job Stacking, guarantees you'll be able to double your income. This is the exact system Rolf has used to take his own income and those of many others beyond $20K a month. So what is job stacking? It's this idea of working multiple remote jobs. You might have heard Rolf, he's worked 5, 7, even 9 remote jobs at the same time before. And by the way, job stacking works equally well for non-technical roles. So no, it's not just for the nerds. So if you're ready to job stack, then book a discovery call with Job Stacking and see how they can double your income in just 9 weeks. In the show notes in the description, there will be a link where you can book a call directly on the Calendly of Job Stacking and be talking with them as early as tomorrow about how to double your income as quickly as possible. Quick note for the audience, My Latin Life, we help people escape Canada. So if you want to exit the Canadian tax system, we have Escape Canada package. We help Canadians do that all the time. And for the Americans, we also help them navigate the foreign income exclusion and so forth. But I'll go back to playing dumb. So I heard about this thing called FATCA, where I guess that's kind of why banks don't want to take American customers around the world because of FATCA compliance, something like that. Is that also on the table for eliminating or addressing in some way?
Yeah, so I mean, FATCA, which stands for the foreign, I forgot what it stands for. Do you know?
No, it's a tough one. Foreign account
FATCA.
tax, who knows? But
I know the
anyway.
other one. There's 2 forms that we have to fill out: the FATCA and FBAR. FBAR is the Foreign Bank Accounting Account Reporting or something. But it's these 2 forms are essentially means of enforcing U.S. tax law. So if we are excluded from the application of U.S. tax law because the U.S. switches to a system of residence-based taxation, then there's no need to use either FATCA or FBAR to enforce the law because we're no longer subject to the law. So that would, with one fell swoop, take away all these problems: tax returns, filing, FBAR, FATCA. We would be free of all of that stuff and only live in the country we live and deal with the local laws, like is the case in every other civilized country in the world.
And is that on the table at all, like eliminating FATCA as part of your proposals?
Well, no, FATCA would remain because FATCA and FBAR are both means of avoiding tax dodgers. It's to prevent tax evasion as well as money laundering. There's other reasons that FATCA and FBAR exist and will continue to exist, not just for Americans who live overseas, but also Americans who live in the U.S. but might try to squirrel away money in a foreign account or something like that. So those will continue to exist. But they would only apply then in the future to Americans who live in the United States, not to Americans who live overseas. because if you and I are no longer subject to U.S. tax law because we don't live in the United States and
Uh-huh.
don't have any U.S. income or property or anything, then we would not be subject to FATCA or FBAR.
Okay. And how might that work? Like um, if you know, you go to a bank in Belgium and they see that you were born in the U.S. on your passport, and you go, no, 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 I'm no longer a resident, so please open the bank account for me, and then you maybe show some proof, but then maybe they say like, still, we don't want to deal with it. FATCA's too insane, or how would that kind of work?
Well, that's a good question again. In an ideal world, the U.S. law, once changed, would basically just tell all these foreign financial institutions, lay off the Americans. They are no longer they are no
Yeah.
longer they're no longer subject to U.S. taxes. Therefore, there's no reason for you to not have Americans' financial accounts. At least as long as they live in that country. I'm sure there would have to be provisions to prevent Americans who live in U.S. from having Swiss bank accounts or Cayman Islands or wherever else. That's another story. But for Americans overseas, a Belgian bank is not a foreign bank. It's my local bank. My foreign bank is Citibank New York, where I've got an account,
Hmm.
and which I have to report to the Belgian National Bank, by the way. So.
Uh-huh.
Um, Americans overseas would be freed of all of these things if the law that we want will go ahead.
By the way, have you heard of John Richardson?
I have heard of John Richardson.
You know John Richardson?
Yeah,
Okay. Um, I asked that as a preface question because so you mentioned the renunciation fee change, the case that they won there was done by a different organization than yours. It was done by the Accidental American
it was the Accidental
organization.
Americans, and the guy who did that sits on our board, so I know about it.
Okay, so I was curious, like, how many organizations are there kind of advocating on behalf of Americans on some of these issues?
Well, I think there are at least 7 or 8 sizable organizations that advocate on these issues. There's the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. There's American Citizens Abroad, Democrats Abroad, Republicans Overseas, the Association of Accidental Americans, and then there's a smaller group called Stop Extraterritorial American Taxation that John Richardson is involved with, as well as Laura Snyder, who runs it. And tax fairness for Americans abroad has really one thing that makes it unique is that we don't have any other issues. I mean, Democrats abroad cover all kinds of issues. For
Right, they
example,
help people vote and stuff.
voting
Yeah,
issues,
yeah.
whatever it might be. American citizens abroad and RO try to help people claim Medicare overseas, and we don't do any of that. We are laser focused on this one topic, achieving residence-based taxation, and the members of our board are people who themselves are associated with these larger organizations. So. We're not an organization of our organizations. Our board is individual people who we invited to be part of our board because they are involved with these other organizations. So we can say that we've got a very deep expertise on the topic. We're working with people who have been doing this for decades, and that gives us some confidence that we know how to go about changing this law.
Okay. And I would love to, participate in this, but I might want to, be a lot of resources. I'm sure maybe people get paid a little bit. Is that part of it? Do you do some fundraising
Yeah.
and draw a bit of a salary, or how do things kind of work?
Well, I wish some of us would get paid for this because I'm actually, sacrificing income. As a consultant, I could be earning money with the time that I'm spending on this campaign. But no, we're all volunteers. None of us gets paid a dime to do this project for tax fairness for Americans abroad. I got into it because the problem that my son had, and that just pissed me off, that my son had to pay 20,000 or $25,000, despite never having earned a cent of money in the United States in his life. Um, So we collect donations, and it was the Association of Accidental Americans which actually got us started because they realized that while they've been very successful on a few narrow campaigns, like getting this renunciation fee reduced, getting all kinds of different European governments to take a look at the privacy implications of European banks handing over tons of data to the IRS, and God knows what what happens with it there. They realized that an association based in Paris was not going to be able to change U.S. law. They needed to work with people, including people like me who born in the U.S., grew up in the U.S., can run a U.S. Registered nonprofit organization. And register as a lobbyist. It's not a foreign lobbyist, but born and raised American lobbyist. So he collected donations, and initially more than I think it was $110,000 to get us started. And we have been collecting donations via our website, and are about to launch a campaign as well to try to ask other people to give us, whatever you can. $5,
Sure.
$10,
Yeah, you guys
$1,000.
need to hit up like Eduardo Saverin or something like that, right?
Well, we're asking some people with deeper pockets to help us as well, but the average donation has been about $70 so far.
Okay. Cool.
And
That's very grassroots. I like it.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of people who volunteered to do more than just give money. They've volunteered testimonials, which we've been publishing on our blog. Some of them heart wrenching, and we've got a pipeline of a lot more of those to come. We've got 150 volunteers that we're going to organize in a meeting very soon to discuss how we can better organize our media relations, our social media, our lobbying team, membership or donor relations, those kind of things, just to sort of as it gets bigger, it becomes harder and harder for one guy to manage.
For sure. Yeah, I'd be hitting up I don't know, Peter Thiel, I think New Zealand citizenship, maybe all the like Israeli American billionaires. Trying to think who else.
Yeah,
But yeah,
we're in contact with a couple of them, but so far our bank account does not show billions. I can assure you. If we did, we wouldn't be running a big donation campaign.
and speaking of for your son, did he say, "Dad, this is your fault. You gotta pay half," or how did that work?
Not at all. I mean, he is happy to be well. Let's say he was, and I think still is happy to be American. And he thinks maybe one day he will move to the U.S. like my younger son. So he understands that that comes with obligations. He's generally pretty law abiding person, but obviously he's not happy about it. I mean, $25,000 is a lot of money for anybody, but especially somebody who's working for a startup company and not making that kind of money.
Sure. Well, good for him for taking it on the chin and not asking daddy for money, I guess.
Well, I get to pay for his wedding now instead.
There you go. I thought it was the bride's parent that pays for the wedding.
Well,
Uh,
everybody's helping.
yeah, I guess things are changing. Um, so I was wondering about another kind of just funny question here. Typically, people that are lobbying Congress and stuff are become under the microscope. Have you dealt with any blowback? Did they, start an investigation into you and into the whole accidental American team, and they're, the IRS is coming for you guys, or is it how's that going?
Not absolutely, not at all. We've done everything absolutely by the book. I mean, it was a lawyer, a French American lawyer in Washington, who helped us get set up. We've got an IRS number, tax exempt status. We're registered as lobbyists with both the House and the Senate. Those requests were approved literally within minutes of submission, so nobody has any issues with that. And it's good because we represent real Americans with real problems, and And most of the congressional staffers with whom we've spoken so far have been quite sympathetic. Some of them, I just talked with one yesterday whose boss, a senator, has lived overseas, so they definitely get it. The person I spoke with, her best friend lives overseas, so she's heard some of this stuff firsthand, and I think there are a lot of people in Congress who do have those connections, and there's just nobody has pushed hard enough to find a solution up to now. That's my feeling.
Hmm. No, I think you guys are absolutely doing God's work, and I think the entire American expat community is
Thank you.
indebted to you guys, or super grateful for what you guys are doing. I was curious because you probably know the history of this stuff more than most people. Was the U.S. at some point a residency-based taxation system, and then they switched to citizenship-based, or has it always been citizenship-based since I think income tax was implemented in like 1913 or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Could you tell us the story there?
It's another really good question. So, as I understand it, the U.S. Used to have a system based on residence-based taxation, but it was during the Civil War that they were afraid of people basically moving to Canada or Mexico and not contributing to the war chest. And
Hmm.
they introduced the citizenship-based taxation. I don't think it's actually called that, but whatever the law was called at the time, the principle was citizenship-based taxation. Say, okay, you can't just move to another country and not contribute to the war against the South. You're going to have to pay into the system, no matter where you live. And they've just never gotten rid of that law. So this is literally a War era law that makes our lives miserable today.
Huh. I thought there was like I always see like little memes on the internet where they say the Federal Reserve and income tax were started the same year. It's not a coincidence. And that was what year was the Federal Reserve? But it wasn't Civil War.
No
Am
idea.
I? Do you know?
No, I don't know that story. But
Okay.
I looked this up when I first started working on this topic, and the citizenship-based taxation is a Civil War era law.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. Interesting. From the north, I'm guessing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the official government, the other ones were the renegades.
Yeah, I mean, well, I went to high school in Canada, so I don't even know the Civil
Okay.
War as well as I should.
Yeah.
Uh,
No worries.
okay, good. Well, yeah, you guys are absolutely doing God's work. And what's the next step in what you guys are trying to achieve?
Well, thanks for the question. So far, we only launched in July. So, our board members have been at this for a very long time and bring a lot of collective knowledge to the table. But we launched with a kind of Independence Day theme around the 4th of July, and have ever since we've been working on a concrete proposal, because talk is cheap. Congress will listen to you and smile, but they want a draft law. They want a draft bill or a written proposal,
Hmm.
which then lawyers who write laws need to turn into the kind of thing that could be submitted, to the floor of Congress. And that's what we're working on now. We're very close to something which is ready to send to the lawyers to be put in the right format. We've got a meeting about this actually in 2 weeks. That gives us enough time to cross the T's and dot the I's and hopefully please everybody. But this is a bipartisan proposal.
Hmm.
And the idea is that it would be at least revenue neutral, so that we're trying to give Congress no reason to fight this. But we still need some champions. We need a couple of Republicans, a couple of Democrats to sponsor the thing in both houses. But we want to remove obstacles to its success.
Sure. I feel like the Latino community would be big on this as well because so many are, Mexican Americans and so forth.
Mexico is one of the biggest countries for expat Americans, so
Hmm.
yeah, I would think they should be involved.
Hmm. And I imagine drafting a bill is expensive. I mean, I've never done it before. Do you get volunteer bill writers or lawyers to do it, or how does that work?
Well, we haven't asked anybody yet, but I think we have a volunteer for that because there are some accidental Americans who then ended up working in the U.S. And I think we've got somebody who can do that. Otherwise, we'll have to pay probably a good fee for that. But I mentioned before that we have hired with the donations the biggest lobbying group in the United States, so that doesn't come cheap. So we want to win. So we didn't
Uh-huh.
want to just do this ourselves and knock on doors and hope that we would meet the right people. We've hired experts who can tell us these are the people you need to meet. This is what you need to tell them. This is what to send them afterwards. This is how to write the bill. So they will hold our hands through this entire process and uh, supercharge our opportunity for success.
Have you considered ChatGPT to write the bill?
Oh no, but it's a good idea. Just as an experiment, I'm going to do that tomorrow.
Yeah.
ChatGPT, free me from Uncle Sam.
Please write me a bill for the House of Representatives regarding U.S. citizens abroad. I think he could write a banger.
ChatGPT, it would probably draw on tons of published scientific literature, congressional speeches, websites. Yeah, it would certainly come up with something.
At least a draft, get something going.
And
So
we got a draft, and it's not super long. I mean, the draft that we have, which is again not yet legal text per se, but it's 5 or 6 pages, so it doesn't need to be much longer than that.
cool. You wrote in the notes here. Do you want to ask me something about John Richardson? I'm not sure if you're like asking me to prompt you about John Richardson.
Well,
By the
but
way,
you asked
we've
the question.
done.
You asked me the question before. I know of him. I've never spoken with him yet, but I've
Oh,
listened to
okay.
a couple of his podcasts about U.S. tax issues, and he and Laura Snyder quite often do those types of things, and I've listened to those.
Okay, yeah. So I guess for the audience, John Richardson's been on the My Latin Life podcast 3 times, I believe, 3 separate appearances. So if people want to hear more about these issues facing Americans abroad, we did one episode that was a deep dive on renunciation and the implications of that, and what's it called, like deemed dispositions and so forth. We did a couple different ones. So if people are Americans living abroad, especially people considering renouncing, highly recommend looking in the My Latin Life archive for the John Richardson episodes. Um, Happy to get you guys connected. Or
Have you talked about the Republicans overseas proposal on this podcast?
I think it came out. It was like just about 2 months ago, right? Something like that. There
It's
was
in the spring. It came out in the spring, I think.
in the spring. We
But
did
he
talk
wrote
about
that.
it a little bit.
He wrote that. Yeah.
He wrote that. Yeah. So we did a podcast about that actually.
Yeah, so that's for those who aren't aware of it. The Republicans Overseas Foundation has published a proposal. If you just Google, residence-based taxation, Republicans Overseas Foundation, you'll find it, which we think is a very good proposal. It's basically, a call for a overnight switch from citizenship-based taxation to residence-based taxation. I think the biggest handicap is that it's a completely Republican initiative. And the Democrats abroad, say not invented here. There's some things they don't like about it. They talk about the guardrails, for example, that you can't just let everybody move overseas and instantly claim foreign residence. So they want more guardrails. And that's why we're working now. We actually, through Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad, we've got some people in the Republican overseas community and some people associated with Democrats abroad to talk to each other for the first time ever. And it's this proposal that we're working on is the result of those conversations. So we're building on what John Richardson and Laura Snyder and others started, and trying to make it something that we think would better sell in Congress, where essentially anything successful has a better chance if it's bipartisan.
Cool. Yeah, I like it. I think it's funny how it's Democrats abroad and Republicans overseas. So one group prefers the term abroad, one prefers overseas. Me too. I go back and forth on what I like better.
But Mexico's not overseas. Canada's not overseas.
That that's kind of funny. That's true. That's true.
Technically, I think
Overseas
abroad is.
doesn't.
That's what I use abroad. I never use overseas because overseas doesn't really cover Canada and Mexico.
That's funny. That's true. Even like the Caribbean Sea, is that overseas? It's only one sea. I don't know. Um,
Good
uh,
question.
okay. Wow, dude, you just that might have been the most mind blowing
I'm blown.
piece of the podcast right there. Okay, I'm going with abroad moving forward. Okay. And what would happen to, in your proposals, the foreign earned income exclusion and the foreign tax credit and those things? Would that be eliminated?
Let me think about this. 'Cause I'm not an accountant at all. I'm a former journalist and German major. But if you do not live in the United States, you would have no reason to claim that, I think, would you? Unless you've got, unless you live in the US and you've got foreign income to claim. I don't know. You'd
Yeah,
have to.
I don't think it would make sense anymore. I think it would probably get eliminated. And then no worries on that one. And then my other thought would be like, have you guys put together an estimate for how many Americans you would lose? Like where Americans were like, oh, okay, sweet, you're not going to tax me. Now I can finally go abroad. Do you estimate that you would lose like millions of American citizens to living abroad?
No, I mean that's I think wouldn't be in our interest to estimate that number, and we haven't estimated this number. Maybe somebody, the general GAO, I think it's General Accounting Office, they might try to come up with something like that. But again, when we talk about guardrails, the idea is that people should not be allowed to move overseas just for the purpose of evading taxes. And as you know, I suppose it's not that easy. I mean, if the average American doesn't speak other languages, huh? So the options of places to live and continue to speak only English are pretty limited. So and some of those places have high taxes anyway. So you need to think that through before going overseas or going abroad, just for the purposes of evading taxes.
Yeah, yeah. No, it makes sense. I mean, this is definitely a long-term issue, long-term trend, right? People are getting more and more mobile. More and more people are making money online,
Hmm.
and families are more international than ever, right? Like the amount of Americans with like foreign-born parents, I'm sure, is probably like at a near record high or something. So it's something that's going to keep coming up.
Yeah, and retirement is an issue as well. I mean,
Yes.
I've been reading a lot of stories recently about Americans choosing to retire abroad
Hmm.
for a combination of reasons. The cost of living can be lower in a lot of countries, and not only that, but the healthcare systems can be much better, or at least less expensive, in other countries than they are in the U.S. I know people, including myself, who've gone through major invasive surgery in Europe and come out with a bill of like say $50. So even somebody with good insurance in the U.S. is probably going to end up paying a lot more than that because of pharmaceutical copays and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So especially as you get older, health might decline. You might worry about the cost of healthcare in the U.S.
Yep, that's actually a big focus for my Latin life is helping Americans and Canadians move abroad, move to Latin America, to Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, for the lower cost of living. A lot of people haven't saved enough for retirement and kind of don't even have enough to retire in the U.S. And so it's a definitely a growing trend as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so hopefully I'll be able to say one day soon that they can do that and retire easy and rest easy without having to look over their shoulder for the IRS. Right now, as I'm sure you're telling them, they still need to think about that because, like
Hmm.
I said, the banks talk to one another, and even if they try to lie low, they got to have a bank to pay their bills locally, and there's always a risk of being found out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things we help people navigate is like which countries won't tax social security,
Yeah.
right? And so it's Ecuador, maybe it's other countries where they can go, and it's
I
not
may
there's
have
no
to give you
double
a call
tax.
so you can tell me, and maybe it'll be a few more years before I want to think about that. And I think most places in Europe, I would be taxed on Social Security. Maybe Ecuador
Mm.
would be good.
Latin America, man, it's the final frontier. Cool. So that's pretty much everything we have time for today, Brandon. Do you want to take this time, let people know how they could get involved with your organization, how they can get in touch with you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. It's very easy to find us. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Just search Tax Fairness Abroad. The full name is Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad. There's a page on our website called Help Us, where we'd love to hear your story. The donations are completely voluntary. You could just tell us your story without having to make a donation, and then we're using these stories in our conversations with congressional staffers and eventually members of Congress. There are a lot of other Americans abroad organizations that do the same thing, doing surveys or collecting information. But I would like to say that I think we're going to be more effective on this campaign than some of those others, because we unify all of them and their leaders in this one purpose campaign. So taxfairnessabroad.org help us page is a good place to start.
Sweet. Well, this has been another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Again, my guest today, Brandon Mitchener, Executive Director at Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad. Thank you to Brandon for joining us. Thank you to the audience for listening. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, please be sure to subscribe. We put out 2 episodes a week with amazing guests just like Brandon, and you won't want to miss an episode.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, quick note at the end of the episode here. If you made it this far, you might be interested in working with My Latin Life personally to make progress on your internationalization plan. So whether the next step for you is getting residency in Latin America, lowering your taxes, choosing the best country, maybe a little birth tourism, whatever the next step is for you, of course, My Latin Life can help. We've helped people in their 20s, their 40s, their 60s, because I truly believe that Latin America has something to offer people at every stage of life. So if you want to become our VIP client, if you want to work with Vance, myself directly, book a call. There will be a link in the description. There will be a small fee for the initial consultation, and we do that to filter out the time wasters and focus on the best of the best clients. But if you're listening to this podcast and you made it all the way through the episode, I know you're the best of the best. But we're ready to work with you. So book that call. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the My Latin Life podcast, and we'll catch you in the next one.